Hi everyone, welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for tuning in for the 2 o'clock news and politics show. We have a full one for you today. And as we usually get to do, we get to kick off with Jennifer Lawless down at American University to talk about politics inside the Beltway. Jennifer, how are you today?
Good, how are you?
We are cranking up here, that is for sure, but lots happening both in DC and around the country. And I definitely want to kick off talking about Sinclair and that threat to our democracy script, which just made the rounds yesterday. This was a Deadspin video that showed the compilation of Sinclair affiliates reading from the same script. Here in Rhode Island, we looked at JAR 10's involvement as well. What's the takedown there? We saw the president's response, dug in his heel, called everyone else fake news. Is this going anywhere? Will there be repercussions, or are they just going to dig their heels in?
I think there could be repercussions because it looks as close to explicit government propaganda as we've ever seen, right? We know that the president doesn't believe that the mainstream media are able to cover him objectively. We know that he gets most of his news from Fox News. We know that he thinks that there's no fairness in the mainstream establishment. But this is the first time that we've actually seen a White House pretty much write the script and demand that a set of mainstream media outlets, as part of Sinclair Broadcasting, say exactly what it is that he wants. And so, I think the general reaction among the media as well as political activists is that this is probably a step too far. And we're also beginning to see some of the people who were required to read those scripts have begun to fight back. We saw that in Seattle, for example, where some of these anchors are saying, wait a minute, I can't believe I was just forced to do that. This is crazy.
I mean, talk about your reaction when you saw that video, just from a video editing standpoint of compiling all the same words. I mean, literally, what did you think when you saw it?
I mean, I thought it was a campaign ad. At first, when I saw it, I thought it was a situation where, like, the Republicans or the Democrats are airing a series of statements, that Nancy Pelosi or, Paul Ryan said, and having all of the candidates repeat those kinds of things. It was stunning to me because it was unbelievable that that was not rehearsed, right? That was just people willing to read the script that was put in front of them. And that's, I think, very scary when we think about journalists as being sort of this independent fourth branch of government. If this is the kind of slippage that we can see, it opens the door for a lot more propaganda than I think the United States realized we were, well ready to accept.
And I mean, as far as pushback goes, I mean, do you think Sinclair will see any? We've heard from Kentucky, one congressional candidate pulling ads there, or are they almost that too big to fail?
They might be too big to fail, but I don't know how much success they'll have in acquiring additional outlets. And if they want to continue to grow their reach, then I think this threatens that a little bit. This also really opens the door for the mainstream media becoming explicitly partisan, because you can imagine another reaction, which would be that one of their competitors would decide, okay, well, if they're going to be the Trump news outlet, we're going to be the opposite of that. We're accustomed to that with Fox News and with MSNBC. We're not really accustomed to that with the 6 o'clock news in our local communities. And that's a pretty slippery and I think dangerous slope to go down.
And you talk about at the local level, we've definitely seen some pushback here, especially in social media. I've seen from folks saying, well, that's it, I'm not going to watch. Do you think it will affect not just advertising, but their bottom line and viewership?
I do, and I also think it affects citizen knowledge and participation. The local media are one of the dying breeds of media in this country, but they're still the main source of information that citizens access when they want to know what's going on at the city level or in county government or at the school board level. And if more and more people are unable to rely on those outlets, and if revenues decrease in those outlets, then that's going to mean serious decreases in potential information going to citizens. And that sort of throws into question the watchdog nature of our democracy as well.
Well, it's continued to dominate the news. After you, Jennifer, we're going to have Kate Israel from Rhode Island College talking about the media implications. So let's tag from Sinclair to the Hill. Let's talk about the collapse of yet another look at DACA and where things currently stand.
This is actually unbelievable to me, because the president doesn't seem to realize or remember or whatever that he ended DACA. So the fact that he's blaming Democrats and saying that the Dreamers are in this really bad predicament because the Democrats let them down, at the same time that he's saying that under no circumstances will there be any DACA deal is somewhat stunning to me. And I think a lot of journalists and a lot of Democrats are also sort of left with their, not sure what to do or how to respond. I don't know if you saw yesterday or the day before at this press conference, Jim Acosta from CNN said, wait, President Trump, don't you remember you're the one that killed DACA? And he looked at him like he was crazy. Right. And so when that's how you're dealing with a White House, it's hard to figure out the next steps. But it leaves Congress in this very, very tricky position because they don't want to have this issue unresolved heading into the midterm elections. But by the same token, the Republicans cannot in any way count on a White House to work with them to generate a compromise.
So is it anyone's guess what happens now?
I think so. Donald Trump has taken every possible position on this issue as you could imagine in just the last couple of months alone. So, I'm reluctant to say that, well, there will never be a compromise, because the fact that the president said there will never be a compromise suggests that there probably will at one point be a compromise.
I never know what to expect down there. And speaking of, did he or didn't he, former Veterans Affairs Secretary Shulkin fired, resigned, and why does it matter which?
So this is a good one. Donald Trump and the White House say that Shulkin resigned. Shulkin then made the Sunday morning news tour and has been on pretty much every network since then saying absolutely not. He was fired. John Kelly gave him a heads up, but he was officially fired via tweet, which is not the first cabinet secretary now to be fired via tweet. And I think this is important because it's clear that Donald Trump is reshuffling the cabinet with people who he wants to surround himself with. And it's not that there are people in there who are unwilling to go along with his agenda or who are making his life difficult and who are resigning. It's that they're all being forced out. And the fact that the administration explicitly lied about how Shulkin was fired suggests that they are not at all concerned about the optics of these kinds of things. So, I think that it just highlights one more area where the press and communications office in the White House is not particularly concerned about the way things appear.
And you talk about the way they appear. I mean, there must be some concern from the Trump administration to say that, oh, he resigned, when he pushed back and said, no, I was fired. So do you think they have concerns, as you said, as they're reshuffling the deck, they want to make it seem like he opted out, but when in fact he's saying he was pushed?
I think that they have so much other stuff going on that this is not something that they have to even really worry about. They're focused more on his successor, who is completely unqualified and has no managerial experience. And they're also now focused on other cabinet secretaries and other departments. And so, this is one of the positive repercussions for the Trump administration of so much news happening so frequently. No one thing is something that they have to constantly hit back on because there are a million things being thrown at the wall.
So speaking of the million things, my list is quite long here. Let's go to EPA Scott Pruitt. Does he survive?
Well, Donald Trump tweeted and called him and told him not to worry about it. You're good to go, which is basically the recipe for being forced out in this administration, right? So he had done the same thing to Rex Tillerson. He had done the same thing. He had a conversation with Shulkin the day that he was fired and had actually scheduled a meeting with him for the next day. He did the same thing with H.R. McMaster. So if I were Scott Pruitt, I would be packing my bags right now because this is sort of the lead up to being sure that you're not going to have a job in about a week.
And so let's talk about that revelation that he was basically lodging at a lobbyist's property and, $50 a night in Washington, D.C. Should he have known better?
Of course. But yes. But I also think in the broad scheme of things, this is one of those situations where if the administration was keeping tabs on what its cabinet secretaries were doing, this wouldn't have gone on for as long as it went on. So, I'm sort of stuck between a rock and a hard place here because I think a lot of these offenses are fireable and they should be forced out because this isn't the kind of government that you want. And these are abuses that we wouldn't accept in any other realm or in any other industry. By the same token, all of this was completely public and well known, and that's been the case in all of these cabinet positions, in all of these agencies. And the White House basically turns a deaf ear until it's politically expedient for them to fire this person. So, I just don't think that. I think he's gone, but it's probably not going to be because of the lodging. It's going to be for a variety of other reasons, or who Donald Trump would prefer to be surrounded with.
Keeping an eye on the revolving door in the Trump administration, let's tack over to Special Counsel Mueller, We did see the sentencing today for lawyer Alex Vanderswan. Is that really a household name in DC right now?
Only so much as it signals what these consequences will be for lying to the general counsel, for lying to Mueller, and lying to the independent counsel. So, he was given basically a slap on the wrist. So 30 days in jail, a semi, hefty fine. But I think more importantly, and the reason everybody's paying attention, is because it lets us know the kinds of punishments and the deals that Mueller is likely going to cut with names that are more common and known in the typical DC household these days. And the fact that it was a slap on the wrist, I think, should scare the Trump administration pretty substantially, because it means that Mueller is willing to, extract a lot from the people that he's cooperating with. And as a result, reward them with relatively small penalties, assuming that this is indicative of what we can expect moving forward.
I think that was the indication with, again, the 30 days for Alex Vanderswan. Let's talk a little bit, speaking of legal matters, we didn't get you on the show last week, but it continues to be an issue here in Rhode Island and other states, the 2020 census. There was just an event with Democratic leaders here yesterday in Rhode Island about the citizenship question. We talked with the Republican side here, which I want to pick your brain about shortly. But do you think these states that are filing this suit regarding the question of citizenship have any hope of winning?
Yes. For a couple of reasons. The first is that the facts that the White House is basing sort of their decision on and saying that this question has been included except for 2010 are just blatantly not true. The question has never been asked to every census recipient. Never more than 20% of the recipients have gotten that question. And, this is a situation where there are now really big ramifications that have to do with redistricting and reapportionment. And we've seen the Democrats win in several of these other redistricting cases over the course of the last year or so. So, to the extent that there are real disincentives for people who are immigrants to report their citizenship, that can very much affect Democratic urban areas, and that affects the overall count. It affects how many districts a state gets, and it affects the district lines around the districts that it does. And so, when you've got 17 states in the District of Columbia already saying this is not okay, I think that there's a decent shot.
Well, I don't think anyone's probably quaking in their boots more than Rhode Island, who could possibly stand to lose a congressional seat in the 2020 census. But again, on the Republican side of things, here we heard from everyone from Minority Leader Patricia Morgan, who very much backed the Trump administration on it. Joe Trillo, the former campaign chair for Trump, who's now running as an independent, did. Mayor Alan Fung, however, was silent on the issue. I mean, I'm assuming some Republicans will find themselves between a rock and a hard place.
I think any Republican that has a heart and a head will find themselves between a rock and a hard place. And I'm comforted to know that Mayor Fung is in that category. I mean, this is a situation where under ordinary circumstances, the question would be somewhat alarming and there could be real consequences for the count. But at this current point in time, what this administration is doing with immigration policy and the information it's collecting makes it absolutely absurd to think that this is an appropriate question to ask and get any kind of relevant information from. So if this isn't an explicit power grab, then I've never really seen one. And the consequences, I really think, could be very dramatic, not only for our district lines, but also for us having a general sense of how many people live in this country. And that's the kind of information that's somewhat useful to Democrats and Republicans alike.
To get a full count, a real count. Well, we still have you here. One or two more questions, Jennifer. Let's talk about, it was just a week ago Sunday, Stormy Daniels got the biggest ratings ever on 60 Minutes. We've seen it sort of settle into the legal machinations now, suits, countersuits, etc. Is this the last we've heard from Stormy Daniels, or do you think there's more to come?
Oh, I think there's more to come. I think the 60 Minutes interview was sort of the pinnacle in that she needed to communicate to the American public that she was a smart person who was not just trying to drive up her own personal success. And I think that she did that well. I think Anderson Cooper did as well as any journalist could do in that situation. But it now makes sense in terms of how the legal process works that we're going to hear less from her while the case is beginning to move through and while there are questions about who's allowed to ask whom what and when. But I think we're far from this being the end of the Stormy Daniels controversy.
And is sort of the big point here, the one that folks keep focusing on, again, that payment just prior to the election, is that the smoking gun? Is that the potential for an illegal campaign contribution, whether or not the president knew about it? Or are there other things to look at as well?
I mean, I think that that's a big part of it, but we also know that campaign finance violations are really hard to prove, and they're also very difficult to generate any real penalties around. So it's pretty much up to the Federal Election Commission, which is a political entity. And on top of that, you've also got a situation where playing dumb seems to work. We also have precedent suggesting that, John Edwards, for example, had a pretty, substantial public trial and was able to get off of that. So it's not as, his circumstances weren't as perhaps damning as Trump's, but I don't think we're going to take down a presidency on a campaign finance violation.
Well, we'll continue to watch everything going on inside and outside the Beltway. And Jennifer Lawless, I appreciate, as always, you're taking the time to Skype into us here at GoLocal.
Have a good week.
Okay, thanks, you too. Jennifer Lawless down at American University giving us the skinny inside the Beltway. Lots to talk about this week. Lots to talk about here in Rhode Island. Don't go anywhere. We'll be back with our next guest. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel. Thanks for joining us for the 4 o'clock news and politics show. I'd like to welcome in my next guest, Deming Sherman. I appreciate your taking the time to come in. The special master that in the UHIP debacle basically here in the state, appointed back in November. We're about 5 months along now.
That's correct.
And take us through the process of when one gets appointed a special investigator, special master, excuse me. And was it what you expected, or was it worse?
Well, let me give you a little background so you understand what happened here. The so-called UHIP system went live in September of 2016. And as everyone knows, it had a lot of problems. And as a result, the ACLU brought a suit, specifically relating to food stamps. The UHIP system is larger than food stamps, but food stamps was the objective of the suit, to compel the state to get food stamps out to people who deserve them. The state entered into a consent decree in February of last year in which they agreed to reach certain thresholds over a period of time, ending up with a threshold of 96% timeliness of processing of applications. In the summer and fall, the state was falling far short of the 96%. They were down in the 50s and 40s, and as a result, the ACLU brought a motion in the federal court to compel the state to live up to its agreement. It was at that point that I was called by the judge, and he told me, this is Judge William Smith in the United States District Court here, and he said to me that he was considering appointing a special master to oversee the consent decree and to nudge the state into compliance, and wanted to know if I would be willing to serve. And I said, certainly, it's important to get food on the table for people who are deserving, and I agreed to do it. And that was when I was appointed in November of last year. Now we're 5 months in, and I have to say that we have made progress, or the DHS has made progress. I think the current administration, headed by Courtney Hawkins, who's the director, is making a real conscientious effort to solve the problems. But there are two types of problems. One is staffing, which the DHS can control, but the other is technological, which is where Deloitte Consulting comes in. They were the designer of the original UHIP system that then got expanded. The original system only was really essentially a healthcare exchange under Obamacare. And then it got expanded a year or two later to include other social service programs like Medicaid, welfare, and so on, and including food stamps. And that's really where the problem lies, in my judgment. And that is, it was an effort to combine 5 different social service programs, all of which have different criteria, into one program. And the idea was, and it's not a bad idea, it's just the execution wasn't very good. The idea was that someone could file a single application, and then someone would decide which of these social services that person would be entitled to based on that application. Unfortunately, the system just hasn't worked very well. But I have met regularly with Deloitte. I've met basically every 2 weeks with DHS and Deloitte. There is a schedule that exists where Deloitte is fixing certain problems, and there's a major fix coming up in May, on May 19th, the date of the royal wedding.
What is this major fix? Don't leave us in suspense. I mean, is this going to fix the system?
Well, this is a fix which relates to what's called the worker inbox. It's one of the elements of the system, and the worker inbox is the method by which work is allocated to the workers within DHS, and that's been a source of major problems. So the system, as I understand it, could be ready to go now, except people haven't been trained. And I've made it clear to Deloitte and to DHS that as far as I'm concerned, this new fix is not going online unless A, it's been tested, and B, people have been trained.
And have they agreed to that?
Yes. Yeah, and that's the objective. I mean, I think everybody's in the same boat on that. We don't want another disaster like almost 2 years ago.
So explain a little bit. You talk about the worker inbox being the issue. We've had Steve Brown here in studio before talking about the food stamp issue. Is there just sort of a bottleneck with the applications? I mean, folks want to know why folks aren't getting, and the folks who were expecting these benefits want to know why they aren't either. Is that, you know, as you talk about staffing, you talk about the technology, was it just the inability to get it in front of the proper person in the proper time frame?
The short answer is yes, but there are a lot of pieces to the answer. When I first was appointed in early November, I spent the next 2 or 3 weeks talking to everybody I could. I visited offices, I talked to DHS, I visited the centralized scanning center, I talked to obviously ACLU, but I also talked to various social service agencies who help people fill out applications. I talked to the Federal Nutrition Service, which oversees the program, and I talked to what's called the Center for Law and Economic Justice, which is the co-plaintiff with the ACLU in the lawsuit. And they're a 501c3 organization based in New York that deals with issues relating to services for low-income people around the country. So as a result of talking to all of these people, I concluded that there were 6 or 7 areas that really needed to be addressed. And one was the worker inbox. But the others were the call center in Pawtucket, where people had to wait 2 hours or more for information about their application. One was the scanning center in Warwick, which is a centralized scanning facility, which wasn't working right. Documents would get scanned in at different times, and they were supposed to be married to each other at some point, and instead they were floating off in the system. Under this system, there was supposed to be what's called a customer portal where someone could sit down at a computer with assistance and do everything online, right, with a computer instead of filing a paper application. And that never worked very well. There were long lines at some of the offices, especially in Providence.
Oh, we saw.
And we did. But let me tell you that a couple of fixes that have been made, for example, in Providence, within a short period after I came on board, DHS looked at the Providence office and they said, why don't we create a separate area just for food stamp applications, so-called SNAP applications. That's the acronym. It's the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, SNAP. And so what they did was they took an area that was unused and set it aside for just SNAP applications, and that has helped quite a bit. It's reduced the lines, and it's also enabled people to get their food stamps quicker than they would otherwise.
So would those be people who are just getting SNAP benefits but aren't utilizing UHIP for other
No, well,
benefits as well?
For that particular area, yes, just
okay.
SNAP benefits. But so what the effect of that was is to make the time shorter for other benefits, because you're taking a certain group of people and you're saying go over here for SNAP. So I guess so those were the areas that I looked at. There were also some other problems, but those were the principal ones. And so now the question is, well, where are we? You know, what's going to happen? And here's where I think we are. And the average of the last 2 months, from a percentage standpoint in terms of processing of applications, has been in the 80% range. There are two types of applications. There are what are called expedited applications, which have to be turned around within 7 days. Those are the applications by people who are the most needy. And over the last 2 months, the percentage reached on those applications has been about 87%. So about 10% short of the goal. And then for the other applications that are not expedited, where the state has 30 days to turn them around, at least in theory, the average was around 81%. So there's a little more work to do there. Now, my objective is that by the end of June of this year, my objective is that the state be in compliance.
So that's your exit. That's your exit date.
It's not necessarily, because I think the judge would probably say, Mr. Sherman, I want you to stay on and just monitor.
Just keep an eye on things for a little bit.
There's no slippage.
So you're making them test for this May 19th.
Right.
Big
Which I think is going to go a long way to closing that 10% gap.
Okay.
That's why it's important.
So you mentioned among the areas that you looked at that need to be addressed, and one of them that you had talked about was the customer portal.
Right.
How much is still being done in paper, and how much is being done online? Are they making the shift to online?
Mostly paper at this point.
Okay.
And that was another problem. The application was almost 40 pages long. I would challenge you to fill out the application. So DHS is actually working on a shorter application, and that's another objective.
That you think can help.
Absolutely makes it simpler. I mean, how
40
can
pages.
someone pay out? No, it covers all the 5 programs that are part of what's called the Rhode Island Bridges. That's a segment of the UHIP system. Those are the 5 programs, including food stamps. So if the application can be reduced substantially, and I don't know exactly where they are at this point, but if they could be reduced to 5 to 10 pages, it would be a major achievement. And I think all of this is possible with the right effort, and I think DHS is making the right effort. I found Deloitte to be very cooperative. I've never had any problems with them, but trying to fix a computer system where there are all sorts of glitches, I've likened it to trying to turn the Queen Mary. With the Queen Mary, you start to think about turning it on a Friday, and you don't actually get to turn it until the following Monday.
It's a big behemoth, and clearly your focus is moving forward, looking at the goalposts ahead of you, so to speak. But folks have asked, that how did this turn on if it wasn't ready to go? Was it just more testing was needed? Could the glitches have been caught ahead of time, or could no one actually have foreseen this all being the perfect storm?
Well, understand my role is, I'm not Robert Mueller.
No, you're looking forward. I know you're not looking back.
But on the other hand, I've picked up a lot of information along the way. I think the short answer is that the system went into effect prematurely, and the technology just didn't work. And that was a joint decision between Deloitte and the administration at the time. The federal government had sent a letter previously saying, we don't think you're ready, don't do it. They went ahead anyway for whatever their reasons. And that's what happened. And then the other thing that happened at the same time that the system went live in September of 2016 was a lot of the people who had worked on food stamps and the other programs were laid off. And so there was no backup. And so one of the solutions that we've been working on is rehiring people to process applications. I issued an order a few weeks ago that related to the call center that I gave the state a little nudge to get some outside help from a vendor to process calls, and there were some bureaucratic obstacles that needed to be overcome, and I tried to short circuit it by issuing an order, and I think that and it has to be cleared by the federal government, but I believe that it's about to be cleared, and I think that the outside vendor will be working within a week.
How many folks are we talking about staffing up with the outside vendor?
Well, right now there are 30 full-time people, and there are really two pieces. There's the desire of the DHS to upgrade the call center jobs to attract more qualified people.
Okay.
That's number one, and then number two is hiring additional people who are trained, and I would guess that we're talking in about at least 20, maybe 30 people.
So
in the short term.
In the short term, because at the outset, had the state not their thought was this will be so streamlined, we just don't need all these people. We can incur cost savings by letting them go, and that was premature. So let's just talk about who's picking up the price tag. Who's picking up the check here? Is the state incurring the costs for the additional staffing, and is Deloitte incurring the costs for the technological overhauls?
Well, that's a good question. I don't have the answers there because it's not really what I'm focused on. But I do know that the state expects that Deloitte is going to pick up the extra costs that have been incurred and will be incurred in making the system work the way it's supposed to. There are discussions that have been ongoing between the state and Deloitte. I am not privy to those discussions. That's not my job.
You have a very specific jurisdiction.
I have a specific job, which I was appointed to undertake, and I'm doing that. But I think at the end of the day, there will be a settlement of some kind between the state and Deloitte. I do know, and based on my meetings with Deloitte, that they're anxious to get this fixed because this is clearly costing them money. They have hundreds of people working on this. I've been to their offices several times here in Providence, and just in Providence, they have a second floor of a building on Charles Street, and there must be 50, 60, 70 people there at any one time, all with their computers and all coding or whatever they're doing. And then I know they have people outside of Providence, and I believe they also have people in India. So it's a major undertaking.
All hands on deck.
It's clearly, and so they have an economic incentive to fix this, and they've had some problems in other programs that they've instituted around the country. So this is not the only problem. It's a serious problem, but it's not the only one.
It's not their only one. And let's look to May 19th. Are you optimistic? I mean, I know you talked about this has to be tested, and the people have to be trained. But again, it might not be your purview to make that call. If it's not ready by May 19th, could that possibly not be the launch date? Is it really,
Yes,
it has to be ready to go before it's actually launched?
Yes, the answer is that it's scheduled to go live on May 19th. And my understanding is that the program itself is in place. And so between now and May 19th, there'll be training of DHS personnel so that when it goes live, not only the system works, but people will be trained to work it. I don't have the authority to say don't go live. However, I think I can make my view known, that it would be unfortunate to have the new fix go live if we're not ready.
In your estimation, again, you were brought on board in November. We're kind of at the 5-month mark. May is going to be an important due date in the grand scheme of things. Will UHIP be fixed?
Well, no, and I'll tell you what I mean by that. I'm hopeful that the portion of UHIP that I've been working on will be fixed. But will the whole system be fixed? I don't think so. But I think by fixing the food stamp piece, it's going to have a positive impact on the rest of the system. I've made it clear that my priority is food stamps, and the largest number of people in the system are on food stamps. So, I mean, it's really quite astounding when you step back and understand the scope of the problem. There are 150 to 170,000 people in Rhode Island on food stamps. That's a lot.
Yes.
There are applications each month in the range of 5,000 that have to be processed. So it's a big social service problem. There are a total of, I think, roughly 300,000 people in the state who are receiving the benefits of social services of one kind or another. So within UHIP, which includes the health exchange, I have nothing to do with that. But the subset, Rhode Island Bridges, the principal piece of that relates to food stamps. The other pieces, there are problems, but they're not as severe.
Okay.
And there are also, except for Medicaid, many fewer people are affected. So will it fix UHIP? It'll fix a portion of UHIP if my optimism is justified. Will it fix the entire system at that point? No, I don't think so.
Do they need Deming-Shermans for all the other pieces of it as well? I mean,
Well,
it's not your area to oversee, but are they systemic that need to be addressed strategically by the state as well?
Well, that's hard to say, but what I can say is that there was a second suit brought by the ACLU, a different attorney, that related to notices in the Medicaid program.
Okay.
That the notices that were going out were inaccurate, or they weren't going out at all. That's been fixed. So, at least that's my understanding. So that litigation is resolved. I'm sure there are problems in the other areas as well, because, for example, if the worker inbox is how the work gets distributed among the DHS employees, it relates to all the programs. So if you fix the worker inbox, you should fix it with respect to all the other programs as well. I can't say for certain. My objective is food stamps, which I think is the most significant problem right now.
Well, as we've seen, we've had Steve Brown in here, and I appreciate having the opportunity to get you in here at this critical juncture, looking at May, looking at the numbers, as you said, getting better, but hoping that it can make that final push in the realm of food stamps under the UHIP program. So, Deming-Sherman, I appreciate your taking the time to come into the studio
nice to
today.
meet you. Yes.
Okay, we'll let you go around the corner. We'll be back with our next guest here in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. Hi everyone, welcome back to the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. I'm GoLocal News editor Kate Nagel. I'd like to welcome back Rhode Island College Professor Emeritus Kate Israel. Thank you for coming back into the studio.
Beautiful day.
It's a gorgeous day here in downtown Providence to talk all things news and politics and media. The big story this week is Sinclair, that viral video that's gone around about the script that has taken the media by storm about newscasters reading again this kind of very pro-Trump agenda.
The basic problem with the script is the fact that there is a script. In other words, the content of the script isn't all that complicated. It says, there's fake news out there. We don't want to be guilty of doing it. Therefore, let us know. But the problem is that when you've got, according to one study last week, 62 stations broadcast that, word for word, with a different, of course, local person making the statement. The problem is they're basically trying to establish their credibility by establishing a relationship between the local broadcaster and the audience, and not pointing out that it's their overall message, which Sinclair has been pretty strong with over the years. It's basically they're trying to sneak it in, is the best way to put it. And it's not the first time they've done it, but what's happened is, as far as I can tell, there's been at least one station now that has come out and said that we're not going to do it. In Madison, Wisconsin, we're far ways from there. It certainly hasn't hit the Providence area as far as I know. But it's a situation in which we've got the ownership of a number of stations trying to expand their ownership. And I'm going to try to put it in context, if I may. If one goes back to 1934, we had the Federal Communications Act. And in it, they tried to balance the public interest with the idea of controlling the air. And it set us basically procedures that said you could own 5 TV stations in a market. Correction, 5 markets nationally. After a period of time, they modified it. During the Reagan era, they expanded it to 7, and eventually to 12. With a Republican Congress, Clinton, during his presidency, expanded it to not a certain number of stations, but the idea that you'd have no more than, I think, 39% of the market. Sinclair, with their latest effort to try to take over the Tribune stations, is going to have well over 200 stations and 72% reach in the United States. It's an incredible amount of influence.
Well, I mean, as you talk about the changes in the FCC rules and regs over the years, I mean, is that legal?
It's perfectly legal because the Federal Communications Commission, in this case, makes the decisions as to how to enforce what they want. It's the thing that makes it interesting is that when they expanded it up to 39%, it just happened to be the exact number that one of the applicants was going to reach. And I have a faint feeling that they're going to announce a possible cap of 72% any day now.
So let's talk about what we've seen. You've seen it in social media. I'm sure from folks saying, wow, I couldn't believe this. Again, the scriptedness of it. I was speaking with Jennifer Lawless down at American University. I mean, is Tribune too big to fail? Are they going to get any backlash or repercussions from this?
I think they're going to get backlash, but the question is whether it's going to be now or in the 2018 election. I think what we're basically seeing is that an assumption was made at one point that the idea was with enough media, the average voter or citizen could get enough information to make a decision. The problem is that we've seen more and more narrowing of that informational process. Newspapers aren't as effective. Social media is fairly important, but the #1 source of information, according to most studies now, is local news. He who controls local news probably has more influence than just about anyone else. And if it happens to be an organization that takes a conservative viewpoint, that has actively campaigned against Democrats in the past, it isn't exactly what you call, to quote another network, fair and balanced.
And so you talk about potentially either ramifications taking place now or closer to election time. Do you think we'll see, I know there's a candidate in Kentucky that said, no, I'm not putting any advertising on my affiliate down here of Sinclair. Will we see more of that?
I think...
Or is it so difficult for the candidates, like, oh my gosh, but their reach?
The problem is reach, but that reach is diminishing. And it's just the ability to try to set an agenda across the nation that Sinclair has that strength in. I think we're going to continue to see diminished influence of television. There's no question about it. We are seeing, quite honestly, the fractionalization of information. We're fracking it.
Information fracking. We are in the ground.
I know it.
Trying to find that natural gas. And so, what does that mean for the electorate?
It means, well, first of all, we're living in a cocoon era, as you know.
Yes.
It means people get information from where they want to get the information, rather than getting what might be more neutral sources. The whole idea of journalism up through the 50s and into the 60s was the idea of objectivity. The idea was that there were enough newspapers out there and enough TV stations that you had to be objective and neutral. But what we've seen with the emergence of 24/7 news and cable news is that people are now beginning to gravitate towards their opinion. And so what we're going to see, I think, is more and more division, as I said, fractionalization, if there's such a word, of the population, and less healing.
And so you talk about folks going on to get the news that they want. Was this really started by Murdoch in the Fox era?
I think, yeah. I tend to think. I think it was enhanced significantly. Let's put it that way. We've seen other forms of communication that appealed to that bias, but I think Fox sped it up. There's no question about it. What we've seen is, the whole term sort of throws me off. We talk about Fox News, but it's not Fox News. It's Fox Opinion. It's not MSNBC News. It's MSNBC Opinion. And the result is that you tune into the station that you like the most, and quite honestly, you avoid the station that you might find yourself screaming at when you're watching it.
And does this not come from the top? Does this not come from the president himself, basically backing Sinclair and calling everyone else fake news?
I think there's a tie in there. The difficulty is that President Trump is the one that's going to have to decide who's on the FCC. He's the one that's going to be pushing enforcement or lack thereof, and therefore I think he's getting pretty much what he wants.
So what are things going to look like 2 years, 5 years from now? As you said, we talk about Sinclair and Tribune just being this monolith, but you also talk about, more online and less TV. What does it look like in a couple of years' time?
It's extremely hard to predict.
It's the Wild West.
It's the standard thing. Trying to predict what's going to happen 5 years from now is next to impossible. When they modified the Telecommunications Act in 1996, they did it because they were concerned about the impact of the telecoms, AT&T, Verizon. So they made all sorts of modifications, and look at the influence that they have now. Unless you're looking at your cell bill, it isn't quite the same thing.
Well, speaking of having an inordinate amount of power, we did just see the FTC said that they were investigating Facebook. But once again, Facebook got slapped on the wrist in 2011 by the FTC. And I think in their statement last week when they had issued that, they recognized the fact that Facebook maybe wasn't adhering to everything in the settlement it was supposed to as of 2011. Can these entities be regulated?
Well, the difficulty is that we're seeing more and more of the regulation occurring from a political perspective. And yeah, Facebook may run into difficulties, especially if they begin to show a slight leftward lean. If they bear right, they may get, go to it, go for it. Right now we've got the issue of Sinclair merging with the Tribune Company. Not merging, at least buying them out. Meanwhile, you've got CNN and I guess AT&T talking about a merger. And while the former, that is the Sinclair merger, seems to be, going okay, the other one seems to be in trouble. Now, the question is why?
Is that politics?
And the answer is CNN as opposed to Sinclair.
So, again, this video, seeing the script of it, and you talk about the script being at the crux of it, what was just your gut reaction when you first saw that video?
It sounds semi-neutral. It says, hey, we believe that news should be fair. It should be balanced. But the problem is the repetition. When you hear all those different voices, it tells you that it isn't this local station telling you what they think, but it's coming down directly. And it's not the first time that these stations have sent out that message. What has happened is, at least with Sinclair, you have a political editor. He's sending down the information and giving an indication. It's no different than the Republicans or Democrats coming out with their daily briefing as to what issues should be discussed. It's not the function, at least not the function we used to see when we talked about the news or the media.
So we've seen it so fractured. Well, we see it. I know it's hard to predict, as you said, 5 years down the road. Will it ever right itself?
With my bias, I've got to say I can't see it righting itself for at least the next 3 years. It's going to take a different White House to shift things. If you find this acceptable, you're in heaven. If you don't, it's going to be a very difficult wait.
Well, again, you're an expert on the matter, so this is an interesting time to be in, so to speak. But you've got the historical perspective. I appreciate you letting folks know again how the FCC had regulated, media in the past, and what we're looking at now moving forward. It's the Wild West.
It's an interesting thing where we've moved away from, I think, what the FCC originally talked about, which was the idea of fair and balanced, equal time. That provision to now a matter of pretty much letting a deregulated state take place.
Well, it's a crazy time in media right now. We certainly know that for sure here, and I appreciate you taking the time to give us that perspective. Again, if you haven't seen the video, I'm surprised. So we've got it on GoLocal Prov, again, mentioning the JAR affiliate here, taking part in it as well. So take a look, and we're going to continue to keep an eye on all media matters as they pertain to news and politics. So Kate Israel, thank you for taking the time. I'll let you take your notes with you, unless maybe I'll keep them for a little homework.
Okay.
Okay, Kate Israel, thank you so much. Professor Emeritus from Rhode Island College, Professor in Communications. Very apt to have him here in the studio, following, again, the Deadspin compilation of Sinclair scripting across the country and here in Rhode Island as well, so appreciate his taking the time to come in. It's been a busy day here in GoLocal. We started off at 3 o'clock with Ava Gaudette in the Navigant Credit Union Broadcast Center. 4 o'clock, Jennifer Lawless down at American University. Deming Sherman, the special master as it pertains to UHIP here, gave us a pretty good overview as to where things are at, where he thinks fixes can be made, and where he's not too sure as he simply oversees the food stamp portion of it, but was good to pick his brain, and of course, Kate Israel. So we appreciate your tuning in. We appreciate your feedback. We look forward to seeing you here in studio tomorrow. 3 o'clock is The Taste with Rick Simone. I'll be back with news and politics at 4. So wishing everyone a good Tuesday evening. Keep reading GoLocalProv.com. Read us on Facebook, but we'll see you back here in studio. I'm GoLocal News Editor Kate Nagel.